Well, maybe we can start with some quick introductions. He's a lot more interesting, so I'll start first. My name is Gabby. I run special projects here at Warp, which means at any point of time, my focus is on the most important strategic initiatives to the company. I was also MIT with Ayush. I was course 2, which is mechanical engineering, and computer science, which is course 6. And I've worked in tech. I was a software engineer at Facebook, Mechie at Apple, Google, and then lots of other places, and joined Warp over the last 6 months, and it's been amazing. Maybe I'll kick it off to you, Ayush. Who are you? And then we'll go into the questions.
Great. My name is Ayush. I'm the founder and CEO of Warp. I was class of 2019 computer science here, so course 6. Also, in any of my free time was dabbling a lot in physics, which is what I originally wanted to study. But you come to MIT, you're like, man, CS for the first time. We'll talk more about it, but where I grew up, like I had no computer science courses whatsoever. So coming here, it's kind of like changed my life. But it gave me this. It gave me this like.
Make sure it's on.
Yeah, it gave me this very early like appreciation for building. So fast forward today, very quick. I'm running Warp, and we're 33 people.
As of
one person just signed
yesterday evening.
And last night actually. We're based in New York, almost all in person, growing quickly. But effectively, the simple version of what we do is we're building this AI native employee management platform for high growth companies. So what that means is many of you probably worked at various places, you've gotten paid. If you zoom out at the company level, turns out there's just like this insane mess of like compliance tasks and manual workflows and like lots of tax related things and employee onboardings that are just very, very complex, time-consuming, error-prone. And what we do at Warp is we are applying really just like cutting-edge LLM and agents towards this very old, siloed problem space and bringing something really cool to it. So we'll happy to talk more about it, but that's the quick version.
Amazing. And so maybe let's start out. Tell us a little bit more about your journey, to MIT. Where did you grow up, and how did it get to you today?
Yeah, so I grew up in this like relatively small town in India. I say relatively small town because like even it's a very high population country, so even smaller places like could be really large cities. But I grew up in this town called Kanpur that not many people here would have heard of, but in India it's one of the places that has an IIT. So IITs like the Indian modeled after MITs, but they have many of those. So think of it more like the Berkeley system. So they're the top engineering schools in India. One of them, the top 3 in the country, is in my town called Kanpur. So it was a big influence growing up. Almost this ever looming presence into like everybody, all my peers and students and parents. Everybody wanted me to go to an IIT, and especially if it could be IIT in Kanpur, my hometown, my mom would have been very happy, right? But it always kind of like gnawed at me because growing up, I was just really into physics. I was reading a lot of Richard Feynman lectures on physics. That's like I loved growing up. And so I always had this like tension of, okay, I was like actually like halfway through high school on a straight track to go to the IITs. There's a grueling like multi-year preparation you have to do. For those who are like not from the US, like maybe if you're familiar with like a very grueling test taking thing, this is that taken to maybe it's like extreme conclusion.
Yeah. SATs on steroids.
It's
and actually hard.
It's 1.5 million students who take an exam, hardcore physics, chemistry, math, and I think there's about 5,000 out of that 1.5 million that get into the top schools across the country. So I was probably going to get into, like, based on all my preparation and like the scores and everything, to the top 3, so which would have been potentially in my hometown, but I kind of rebelled internally in the like halfway through high school, and I didn't tell my parents this for a while, but I started secretly preparing for MIT and like coming to the US, which was interesting choice in hindsight. I didn't know a single person who had gone to the US to study. And so it was very like looking back at it, even I'm kind of somewhat amazed. It's like, wow, what was I thinking? And so when I did tell my parents that I was actually kind of like behind their back preparing for like researching what SAT is or like how to write these like essays for US schools, right? They thought I was crazy. I'd lost it. Became very kind of like disappointed in me. It's like my child, he's like completely lost it. But eventually they came around when I did get into MIT and Columbia, and some like news reporters showed up at my home because like there's like 3 students in all of India that get into MIT every year. Which I also hadn't fully appreciated. Like I just kind of like went for it. And then so when it happened, a bunch of like national reporters came up, and they at that point my parents were probably like, okay, I think it's gonna be fine. Yeah. So that was probably like one of the more, I feel like MIT is a place that brings a lot of people from all over the world with very unique backgrounds and stories, but I feel like it was a very interesting journey as far as like that goes here. So very, that's how I got here. Let me pause there.
Yeah. So we touched a lot about your journey to MIT. Mm-hmm. You're here now founding a company. Mm-hmm. Did you always know you wanted to be a founder, or how did you get to that moment?
It's a great question. Let me ask you guys this, like, are you all interested in building or joining startups? And like, what's kind of the outlook on that? I'm assuming, you're here, so kind of some interest, right? Like, but maybe show of hands. Are you interested in being a founder, first of all? Okay. 2.5.
Exactly half.
Interested in joining and working at a startup? More, so almost everybody.
Exactly
it's kind of a superset
half.
of the first question. Makes sense. When I was here growing up and during MIT, I actually never thought that I would start a company, which I feel like is in a little bit of a contrast to the usual stories that you hear about people who start building in school and they are just like in love with the game of startups, building companies, especially like I think in the past maybe 5-10 years, it's become very accessible in some ways, right? Like I'm sure, I remember YC had come in this exact room many years ago. I had attended that talk, and ever since they've like continued coming in like ever more presence, right? It used to be that was contained to Stanford because it was just like closed, but then I think in the last few years, especially as a lot of MIT founders have like taken over, they have realized that you can now come to MIT, convince all these kids to like drop out or whatever, give them $500,000, just like go start a company. But I never really thought that I would start a company because I first kind of like didn't have any exposure to it. I was very academically oriented growing up, like into physics, math, computer science, and when I graduated, I thought that I would just like do sort of engineering, build things, and very quickly became obvious that I think maybe a couple months into my first kind of like normal, I had like this normal kind of like engineering role, and I just kind of realized that like working at a big company as a individual sort of IC engineer, like it just made me bored very quickly. And it was nice but like initially it was nice because like I was no longer a broke college student, right? Like that was a big thing sort of growing up. Like my parents would have wanted me to get a job, financial security and whatnot. So I think in the back of my mind there was a little bit of that, but I realized very quickly that that was not going to be for me. And the more I thought about it, it became clear that like anytime I was working on something that I truly liked, so building something, even in school and outside of school, like if I was building something purely out of my own like agency and interest, I would stay up super duper late, fixing it, building it, polishing it, versus if it's just like, if I didn't have that internal sort of drive towards it, then I'd be kind of lazy, honestly. And so
I can confirm. I was here on campus with him.
And so it kind of, in some ways, I mean, we can laugh about it, but in some ways it was an interesting signal for myself that like, oh, when I'm at my best, it usually happens in this specific setting, in this specific context where I have full ownership, I have full responsibility, therefore kind of like my ass is on the line, and I have nobody else to point to if something like doesn't work. But also it gives me a lot of like intense energy to just like make things work and fully take the responsibility for it. So it got me thinking, and I made the move to join a Series A startup. I moved to New York with Gabby as well. And I was there at this startup for about a year, growing quickly. This was through like the COVID years. And I got to see a lot of like what happens inside a startup, like as you go from that early kind of like seed Series A phase to Series B and beyond. And once I had some conviction on that I want to start a company, I just kind of left that role and decided to take the plunge and what would become Warp.
Yeah. So maybe why, out of all of the things that you could start, why Warp?
It's a really great question. So I, like a lot of college students, I think that one thing that's nice about being in school is that you have a lot of free time to build things. But one of the things you'll notice is that people tend to build very similar things to each other. So they'll like in school, there's certainly like a class of problems. There's a class of things that a lot of students try to build.
Give a few examples.
Okay, so there's this like fun concept called tar pit ideas that I think YC has talked about in many of their talks. But what that means is like things that are a tar pit, essentially this landmass thing where from the outside it looks like very attractive. It's like, oh, this is just like fresh water, and you go in and you start sinking. So it's essentially a lot of college students try to build things that are one way or in shape or form kind of like tar pit ideas because they are not exposed to what problems they should be solving. And so while I was in school, I feel like the best thing to do, the best thing that I got off MIT was just deep like building experience, like go build like as many things as you can. But I felt like I didn't get a great sense of what problems are worth solving. And so in a typical fashion, when I first wanted to start a company, I actually was like, you know what, I want to build a social media app. It's like every 25-year-old wants to build a social media app, right? And maybe the today version of that is some like agentic thing or whatever. But it's very true because people often try to, like getting exposed to problems is non-trivial. And for me personally, like I tried starting like some fun project around like social thing. It was really fun for a bit, and I was like, okay, like, but I very quickly realized that like I was sort of just doing it because it's like a thing that I knew about, not something that was truly worth solving. So I sort of went back to the drawing board and I started like evaluating the problems that I had personally run into in past. So both at the previous startup that I was working at and in the process of actually building this social thing, I realized, and I just kept running into this problem of like hiring people and trying to pay them. I realized that turns out the US has, I'll give you kind of like high level, about 1,000 plus tax jurisdictions. This is a very specific thing to the United States. Almost no country is structured like this, but US, because it's so, like, there's a federal government, but the state governments and the local jurisdictions have a lot of mandate, a lot of leeway. So it's a very distributed governance structure, you could call it, right? India, for example, is a very different way. Most European countries are also very like centralized in that sense, but the US is very fragmented. So all these tax jurisdictions, as you try to build and scale high growth company, hey, welcome. What happens is anytime you quickly become beholden to all these tax jurisdictions very quickly as a company. So if you're the founder of a company in the early days, or as a company continues to grow, usually anyone with like a chief people officer, chief financial officer, CFOs, and accounting people and legal people, they constantly are just like butting heads with these very archaic, old .gov portals, accounts, and like the only interface there up until recently has been these PDFs and these like very annoying websites. No programmatic access whatsoever. So I looked at that and I was like, okay, I think we can solve this finally with how LLMs are getting good at navigating these like disparate, disjoint, complex, sort of long workflows. And this was maybe 2.5 years ago. And actually, it was actually pretty terrible in the beginning, right? If you try imagining like long-running like agents, the progress there was very abysmal in the start, and people were really bearish on it. And so internally, one of the bets we took basically was like, I think this is going to keep getting better, and I think we just kind of have to like ride it out and keep building. And both our architecture and our data getting better and our experience, but also just like the underlying models getting better, we'll be able to make a lot of progress, and it like a year, 2 years is going to look very different. Fast forward today, that's exactly what's happened. So all that's to say, why I started Warp is I had this like sort of meandering journey where I tried doing the thing that I think most like students or college students or right after school people are aware of, which is like do some cool consumer app, whatever, or these days maybe some cool AI app. But I think personally it is very underrated if you think of like what are some really like siloed, disjoint, old things that are not changing, in the sense that the need for that is always going to be there, and you can bring something like truly novel to it now because the tooling has advanced so quickly. So for me, that's what's been really exciting, is like being able to take something so cutting edge and apply it to,
don't worry, keep on going.
I don't know if we need it, but
I think
apply it towards this like really important business problem that every single company in America at least has to deal with. Right now we're very focused on like high growth companies, so we try to focus on a lot of fast growing startups and these like companies that are a couple hundred employees going into thousands and so on. And there I think we see a lot of that, but I think my belief is that every company eventually will want to run on a system like Warp that basically is running itself in the background, and you don't have to actively kind of babysit the software.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
To that point, maybe the reason why we clicked this is my next question is, we call ourselves an AI native employee management platform, right? What does AI native mean in your definition, and what does it mean to Warp?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one of those things where I feel like there's a short window of time where the word has some meaning to it, but quickly the word AI native will quickly become kind of like for granted. Like every company will be AI native. It's almost like, well, you don't say you're a cloud native company anymore, right? Every company runs on cloud. So I think, but in the meantime, I do think that there's some value in differentiating and saying, hey, we are architected in a way that is AI first. We are taking agents seriously, and internally also like in how we build a company and how we like hire people and think about like engineering headcount versus like just like operations people and things like that, like how we divide the company resources. That is also, there's an AI native approach to it where you default for using as much AI tooling as possible. So to me, I think that's been the most important thing, is just like how quickly we've been able to build a lot of the core platform, as compared to something like a few years ago. This would have taken, like, to give you some context, right? Like one of the things I mentioned is like entire employee lifecycle. And this means like any time a new person is hired in a company, there's so many things that like usually have to be done. So kicking off like their onboarding and all the way from like the initial contracts and agreements to like what are all their apps that need to be provisioned, what are the sick leave policy that apply to them, how is that going to work based on like which state and locality they're based in, what happens if they move from like New York to California for whatever reason, like all the underlying sort of policies, benefits, all these things have to change.
They have a baby.
And so all the way to like an employee leaves, and now you have to think about, well, their severance is the first thing, and then you have to think about what happens to their healthcare. Like there's something called COBRA in the United States, which is like you can stay on the coverage for a bit, up to a certain period and so on. So in that entire thing, and that's just one employee, right? And then you kind of zoom out and you've got an entire company and your people are always moving, like their circumstances are always changing, and then the regulatory regime is always changing. So, some new like way of handling tips was passed. I think you guys probably heard the Trump bill changed how like up to a certain amount. Those kinds of things are always changing out there as well. And so managing all of that into a single platform like that can automate that is quite a lot of product surface area. And up until maybe a few years ago with AI and like coming to the scene, this would have taken like 40, 50 engineers and tens of millions of dollars to just get the first version of the product out. In contrast, I mean, up until recently, Warp was a handful of engineers, and we had, before our Series A, which was like 6-7 months ago, we had raised about 5 million total. And that to me is kind of like the big difference in how we're just building the company. And I think it's something that was just not possible. Like you couldn't build an entire platform like this unless you had 2 years of time, 50 engineers, $50 million in the bank. So like, I think there's a lot we could talk about what implications that has for the future of startups and how they're going to be built. But I think, yeah.
Yeah, amazing. I think one thing that's really special about Warp is its foundation in a very contrarian product philosophy, right? You talked about, something called runs itself, right? One of our taglines is engineered to disappear. Can you touch a little bit more on how you came up with that philosophy, especially when comparing to incumbents and their product philosophies?
Yeah, so this is a fun one because I think one of the key things that's changing with AI is so much of software was essentially a nice UI layer on underlying manual things that someone had to do. And so for this like long arc of history, you can imagine like the software efficiency gains were basically coming from the fact that you had digitized some like really manual thing. And now, because of that, you're able to do it consistently, faster, in a more organized way. And that's basically like if you imagine like hand calculating a bunch of like financial models, and then you put that on Excel, well, now you've got this like powerful thing, and it can be replicated easily, cloned, edited, collaborated, no errors basically, right? That drove the first, I call it like the first arc of software up until maybe 2-3 years ago. And I think that was saturating. Like we had sort of reached peak software 1.0 by 2015, 2018. I think there was a lot of fatigue with that was happening with like classic SaaS software, classic like B2B software. Even consumer, so like a lot of consumer software had, I would argue, stagnated maybe even 8 years ago. Like for example, was the last big social app, right? Last big consumer app before ChatGPT. There were only some fleeting viral apps, like it was like Locket, there was that thing, right? But these were just like very consumable, moment in time, be real, very moment in time kind of thing, not really truly sustainable, novel thing. But I think 2-3 years ago, what started changing, and like so many companies have still not realized this, but that era is over. Like traditional 1.0 software of you just like digitize the underlying thing and that's kind of it. And I think the next step, the new long S-curve that we're on is this new phase that is super exciting, is the software actually just does the work for you, as opposed to you are still doing the work, but with the help of software. And that shift to me is like such a fundamental breakthrough in how I think to think about products in general. And we're thinking at Warp a lot about what that means for this really big like company function called employee management. So we're pretty excited about applying that to all things employee management in general. But I think high level, we think a lot about how can we make less interaction? Like how do we like reduce the amount of time that the person has to spend in the software, which is kind of like the anti-approach to traditional software where because you needed like NPS and you needed engagement and you needed them to like bond with your product more, you would make like longer and longer flows so that this is very common in, by the way, I was just looking up, came across the other day, apparently in consumer apps, like Duolingo and so on, right? They'll have a super long onboarding because it actually is proven across millions and millions of users who have downloaded and they've A/B tested this, that like the longer you can make the onboarding without the user just like giving up, the higher their probability of retention. And so there's a version of that even applied to like B2B software in some sense, where like you're not really like directly optimizing for engagement, but people still wanted this like product bonding thing, which is like emotionally you have to get a little bit attached to the software, get used to the software, and therefore incorporate it in your day-to-day, because you have to tell people, hey, this is the thing, this is the system that we all use in the company to do things. But I think that's changing. I think what's changing now is the software sort of adapts to you, so it doesn't have to be this very rigid thing. Like you can ask an AI or an agent, be like, hey, I want to do this thing. How do I do this in this software? So you don't have to just like learn the whole UX, UI. And I think that's the direction that Warp is headed and building towards. So it's going to be a long road. I think we've just kind of begun this overall thing. But to me, all software is headed that way, and we think a lot about that at Warp.
Amazing.
Do you think it will get to a point where UX, UI will die?
Well, I'm sure Rafael has some takes on that. You know, my take is that, well, first, so maybe like if I can phrase it in a hot take kind of way, it's like there's a lot of Twitter threads about generative UX, and I think that's like really stupid, because the thing that humans want, and as long as humans are using these products, right? If humans are not using these products, actually, maybe even then one could argue, but the humans want consistency, and humans want, they are always, like as we are always pattern matching. So why is it that you go to any website and you have a basic skeleton of how information is laid out? So there's going to be a nav bar up here, there's going to be this like big title, product screenshot. There's a reason why almost every website does that, because we have been so like conventionally conditioned to absorbing information that way, right? So it is, yes, you could go ahead and just like make a crazy layout that just like pushes boundary. That might be good if you're trying to do like a personal portfolio, right? Like often a lot of design portfolio pages are really wacky and cool, but you couldn't do that for like a website where customers are supposed to like come understand what the product does and then go through sign up flow or all these things. So backing out, I think, yeah, like a generative UX, like UX that always is changing on the user will never be a thing. So I don't agree with that. And so I guess it does come down to the kind of like the thing of, will humans be still interacting with software directly? And if they are, I think consistency and UX will still matter, although...
Or maybe it'll matter even more.
And who is interacting too, right? Because probably you will cut out the mechanics, the typers that were doing the input or making some small decisions, and it's now only the leadership. I don't know. So it's
Yeah,
kind of
like the day-to-day people might not even interact, and it's just like a more high-level thing for like leaders and strategic people. It's possible, yeah. I mean, like if you look at ChatGPT or Claude, what is the UX? The UX is a very simple chat box. But, and I'm sure Rafael could talk about this too, but like there's so much refinement that they have had to do on that chat UX, like from 2 years ago. If you tried counting all the ways that simple like chat box UI UX has evolved to now like the little copy button that pops up in the inside container. Like if you say, hey, draft this email for me, like now we'll put, like at least with Claude and I'm sure ChatGPT, the email in a separate component, and then you can click copy on that specifically, not the whole thing, because like, right? So there's all these things that they've been refining, and you will notice that as soon as like there's a good UX that any one of these guys come up with, everyone copy it, right? It like Claude's gonna have it, or ChatGPT is gonna have it in a week. So that consistency doesn't ever go away as long as like humans are trying to use the software, even in its like most basic form. When it comes to like business software, I think I would argue the point of business software is to enforce consistency in processes. So they almost, but once again, like UX, UI will still matter a lot. But I think unless we have a world where things, like the end goal, the asymptotic point where like the thing is truly running itself and you just kind of sit back and give it maybe very high level. It's like, the meme that's like, make me $100 million company, make no mistakes, right? By the time we go up to that level of abstraction, at that point maybe it doesn't matter, but no. Go ahead.
You're dealing with potentially like some of the most important stuff in a company,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if you get it wrong, like I'm sure that's terrible for them.
Yeah, I've had many sleepless nights. I can tell you about it.
I'm curious, again, another design question, like how the design shows what's going on. Like if it's all agentic, how do you communicate to the human that's running the company what's going on?
Yeah.
It's a good question. I think one of the things that we have realized is over time, there's a right balance of giving the level of detail to the end user that like if you overdo that, then you're exposing more complexity to them than what they actually care about or are going to find useful. But if you go under that, then I think it kind of undermines the trust or be like, oh, did it actually do that? Like, I'll give you an example. Our payroll, like the pay someone flow, it is so fast that sometimes people, like we legit got people initially who were like, that's it? Like, what? It's like you could like run your entire company is like millions of dollars of payroll and it's like maybe 2 clicks, like, right? And it's like, boom, boom, done. It's like everything's already there, the information, all the earnings and deductions and codes and everything's there. So 1, 2 clicks, done. And we architected the product in a way that it was actually really fast. And so at some point we internally debated, we never actually did it because our CTO Adam, he was like, no way, that's really dumb, I'm not gonna do it. But I legit argued in moments in time being like, we should add an artificial 2-second loading thing here with a nice little visual being like, boom, your taxes are being calculated and like your paychecks are going, right? Because people thought that it was like, if they didn't see that little bit of that, they would think like, oh, nothing really happened. It's just like how humans, I guess, like perceive. Yeah. So to your question, I think there's going to be a optimal point of information of what you should be telling and exposing to the users. And it's almost kind of like progressive, what's the idea called? It's like progressive, basically you just like give more complexity the more you want to drill down. I forget the word, but the concept is basically from video games where the difficulty level, like how complicated of a build you can make in like some RPG. In the best ones, it starts out very like simple, not with like insane like deep tech trees and like skill trees, but as the game progresses and as you get better at the game, you see more and more and more. So I think that idea is something that is actually very relevant to building products that do a lot of work in the background. So if you do want to drill, if you do want to like audit the work of an agent that did for you, you should be able to like expand and be able to audit it. But at the top level, like I think we have to apply some kind of judgment on what is the right at the top level.
Maybe one, because I think this will this fits really naturally.
And we'll come back more questions too.
Is not only thinking about how do you surface, and build trust, with an automation, especially in a field in an industry that's very low fault tolerant, right? But I think there's also a question of, because we operate in an industry that's very low fault tolerant, that's very mission critical, the mistakes that we make are very critical, to business operations. How do you think about where to automate versus where human touch is necessary?
Yeah, so this is something that I feel like I've evolved my thinking on quite a bit, maybe like the most in the last 1 or 2 years. I now believe that the more you can automate, the better. And this wasn't quite the case when maybe like a year and a half ago, when I think it was a bit more like open-ended question on how good the models will be and how much you'll be able to like go full like end-to-end. And what we have seen internally is like the intervention rate on like how often we are finding ourselves having to change something that an AI or agent has like actually already done. It's been on this like very like sharp decline over the last 2 years. And I think it's to a point where I see maybe in like, I clearly see like a year or two next year, it might just go to zero. Maybe not like entirely zero, it's like 0.01 or whatever that asymptote ends up being. But I do think now that it is possible that we just like are able to completely trust these systems, but not trust in the sense as like you are just like counting on it without checks, but more that you can build enough validation and testing and evals and like Q&A into the system to have that confidence that you don't need that many humans oversighting it. The other thing is like, I have found it very hard to, like, it is just fundamentally hard to have great, like, very smart people just like babysitting AI. Like there's only, like, that's a bottleneck to building like a human in the loop kind of system, right? If you think about it. And I think as a result, eventually, I think like companies just kind of are going to get forced towards, let's just keep improving the underlying system and keep reducing the dependency on any human in the loop component. So my thinking now, to summarize, is basically, I think that the more you can lean on software and LLMs and AI and like code in general, the better it is. And so it's actually kind of like, this is a good thing for humans overall. I think like a lot of what we're doing is manual, like repetitive, tedious work in a lot of these roles. And I think like one example is, if you look at any of our like large incumbent competitors, like the ADPs or Paylocity, one fun fact about them, if you look at kind of like their headcount, like 30-40% sometimes of their headcount is in functions like operations and tax and finance. And there's just essentially humans, like lots and lots of them. And the company is basically this like giant ops labor thing where like lots of them are in like these low cost countries and they're like double, triple checking, doing a lot of tedious work. I think that we are going to be able to like do more interesting things with our time when we automate the more tedious. It's not all positive. I think there's some like still, I know there's like underlying question of like what will like humans do. Like as we continue to go up the stack of like, okay, well, this was more repetitive and now this is going away, now this is going away. That is a more existential threat, but I don't know if that's, we chat about this separately.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know, you mentioned like on the slide as well, like right now your focus is on high growth companies in general. I'm sure like as headcount is growing, also the company is going to evolve. And like what the difference is working with like a high growth company versus more of an incumbent, and like how you think about going forward, what that is going to look like.
So if I understand the question correctly, it's something like, as if we're focused on high growth companies, like they evolve and grow quite quickly. And so the product kind of has to keep up with that, right? And how that differs with just like normal general like companies, like take like a manufacturing plant or something. That's a very interesting question. I mean, the reason in startups, like you always have to kind of have a bit of a directionality to which customers or which sets of customers are going to find the most value early on. And so to that end, and this is something that's like not super obvious to like if you haven't tried starting a company yourself. And one of the first things you try to do is you try to really narrow down which sets of customers will quickly find value. Because guess what? When you're just starting out, it's like maybe you are a couple of people in a WeWork or something, and you've got this like first version up and running, and you somehow, in fact, in our case, we're asking you to trust us with like all your money and like your employee data and all these things. So we had to kind of pick our focus, and I think in hindsight, we made a really good choice betting and having a conviction on, we're going to go solve for this like startups and high growth type companies, because from first principles, they just experience a lot of that pain in a compressed amount of time, and also don't have good like staffing or like humans that are dedicated to like finance, HR, accounting that like a large enterprise scale company is going to have. So at least they've like got it covered with like humans just like working on these things countless 24/7. But it really, the other side of that, to your question, is like, because these companies grow so quickly, we are just like, we have no choice but to grow with them, or we'll lose them as a customer. And like, I've had maybe one customer out of now like lots and lots of customers that we lost like that. And I was like, this is the worst thing. We cannot have this again. How do we just like make sure it's never happens? So we're constantly taking this scalability point in the platform very seriously. Just like, how do we, like if a company is going to scale from like 10 people to 100 people in 9 months, which we have seen happen with some of our customers. So that's like on an absolute scale, 100 people is like, okay, it's manageable, but like it's actually the growth of like going from 10 to 100 quickly while you don't have all these like processes as a company. You don't quite know like what's best practice versus not. And Warp still has to just like work across that entire curve. That has taught us a lot, especially on how like to forge and kind of carve out a really strong product. Like there's a lot of fluff in our incumbent vendors that just is like stuff that you don't really need, but they figured out ways to sell it, so they try to sell it to you. But we've had to really just like hone it down, narrow it down to be like, what do companies actually need, and how can we do them like exceptionally well? And I think as we are now starting to go and towards more broader companies, now we actually we do serve normal like all the way from like small, medium businesses to now we call this like growth segment, like a few hundred going into 1,000 employees and so on and above. We are finding that those customers have similar underlying kinds of like, too much like compliance work and manual like state taxes and all these things. And our product is the best one to solve that because we've been forged kind of in fire in some sense. So it's so far, like we're finding that as a unique advantage to how we've built the company.
Any other questions, or we can go back? Okay, great. It is 7:50.
Have time for maybe one or two questions,
One or two
and
questions,
then we'll run out.
Yeah?
Go ahead.
Given where you are now, all of those years between MIT and where you are now, is there anything that you wish you had learned, or is there anything you would have done differently?
Yeah, this is always a great question. There are always, like, looking back, you can always figure out things that you should have done differently. And I will give you one or two of those, but I also, what year are you, by the way, right now?
Probably a senior.
Okay, awesome. So you're kind of coming towards that. So this applies to you too, right? But I think looking back, you can always be like, oh, maybe do this differently, etc. I do find that there's a very famous, inspiring speech, I think Steve Jobs, right? Like looking back, connecting the dots. And he talks about how he took this like calligraphy class that at the time seemed seemingly random. And then he is able to kind of tie it all the way to when they were choosing the fonts for the first Mac. And it was like iconic, and like he was able to draw from that experience. I do think that I find that really, like I resonate with that a lot. Because, I studied computer science, I built a bunch of things, I studied physics in my free time, I studied a lot of like human psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience that gave me an appreciation for how we as humans like think and feel, and what makes us tick, like maybe at a more mechanical level. It'll give you like evolutionary, why are we wired this way we are, and all these things. Like in hindsight, I feel like I'm able to draw on those things now that I'm building a company, building a startup. When I can apply that towards like how I think about products. I can apply that towards how I think about building and scaling a company and an org. And so I find that that's a great view to have. Like I think every experience you're having, it's going to shape you in some interesting way that over time you'll find out and be able to draw from. That being said, I think maybe one thing that I feel like more students should do in school is just, maybe this is somewhat like everybody says this, but it's very true. Just make more use of the fact that you're in this sandbox environment with no real like true responsibilities, and in the moment it doesn't feel like that at all. That's why everyone says this, but no one actually like is able to incorporate because in the moment you're like, oh my god, all these classes, I've taken like 5 really tough courses, and I've got all these pieces and midterms, and it feels like you've got the weight of the world, and now you have to figure out internships and jobs and all these, like what do I want to do, right? All these things. But like, man, it's a construct of our imagination. It's a like we have constructed ourselves this imaginary, not like somewhat real, but this like largely like this weight we have taken on ourselves. But in hindsight, you will always be like, man, this was a sandbox environment. I could have learned anything, took up any class, build anything, use my free time however I wanted. And I think taking more advantage of that, of just like pursue whatever interest you have, go deep on any rabbit holes you can find, and just be like, treat this as these are your years to just do that, and you'll always have the rest of your life for like more professional, career-oriented things and whatnot. So that's my one maybe piece. Yeah.
Amazing. Final question?
Yeah.
Okay, last two.
One or two, yeah.
Mine is about, you said that you found your company idea like later on after MIT. Why do you think so many people like nowadays are, at least it looks like it, I'm not sure if it's true, but are like loads of kids are just dropping out of MIT?
So this is where it's the simple answer is because I think startups have become a little too glamorized, and there's a lot of glorification of startups and founding. I think it used to be that starting a company and being a founder and entrepreneur was kind of low status, but unfortunately, I mean, maybe it's fine. Overall, look, maybe it's a net positive that more people are starting companies because we get to have more people starting new things, right? That's great. But I do think some amount of fact that it became a little too like glorified. I think, on Twitter you will see like people kind of talking about like 996, this, started a company, dropping out, got into YC. I think this is, in my opinion, it is the wrong way to orient yourself towards building a company. Because like, here's the reality, I can tell you right now, it is absolutely terrorizing to build a company and found a company. It is day in, day out. You're gonna have sleepless nights. You're gonna have like heart pounding on days. You're gonna like think like you're really, really dumb. There will be days that just suck. And I wish that people talked more about it. It is very, very hard. And the highs are very high, but the lows feel like, man, this really sucks, right? And personally, I feel like the whole thing has just like made me more of a stable, just like I can kind of now weather any storm kind of a person, because I've just seen so much in the like 2.5 years now. But coming back to your question, I think the answer is because it became a little too glorified, a lot more people started doing it. And I think that is in general, I think back to my previous answer, in school, just like go deep on anything you want, study anything you want. That is probably a better use of time than trying to start a company. A lot of people who start a company while in school, they are neither starting the company 100% nor studying 100% or like being present in school 100%. So you're just kind of, I think you end up diluting that. And then if you drop out, then it's like, okay, well, that was your one time in life to experience this like sandbox free, get connected, talk to all these like really smart peers. You have this incredible place full of brilliant people, like meet with them, learn from them, etc. And for years to come, you'll be able to like work with them in various capacities. So these are the things that I don't think you can get outside of a place like, especially if you're lucky enough to be somewhere like MIT or around here. So I'm actually, all that's to say, I think that we should talk more about how hard it is to start a company. People really glamorize, and actually, why? One of the things you'll see now, so many people start companies, but 7 months later, they've moved on. They're like, okay, I'm shutting this company. Like so many like eulogies of startups, like, oh, how long were you at it? 6 months. Like entire Gen Z companies that get formed and dismantled before like the calendar year is over, before the news cycle on Twitter is over. So I think it kind of is like a glimpse to like, no, if you're gonna be doing this, this is a long-term thing. This is a 7, 8, 10 years thing. There are quick successes, but they're very, very, very rare. They're very outlier. And because they're on the news, you think that's how it is. No, how it is that most companies die. Most companies just die. They don't get anywhere. And then the ones who do, it's a long, hard journey. So I wish we talked more about it. And then when it comes to school, if you're in school, just like make the most out of being in school. You could always start a company. I think the best thing you can do, Paul Graham has a great talk I recommend watching. I think it's like how to prepare yourself to start a startup. And he's basically talking to like college audiences. So I recommend that talk a lot. And I think the TLDR there is basically immerse yourself in like as many domains and as many problems as you can and go deep in things, because that is what is going to be valuable when you eventually, if and when you actually want to start a company. So I'll end there.
Amazing. Final question?
If we have time. So you mentioned the importance of finding the problem you want to solve and the niche market, right? You need to go after. At least at the beginning, it's critical, and I agree. I have been grinding with that. In the journey, so from what I've heard, it seems that you hit the jackpot both times with those big decisions. Have you had more points in time where you were evaluating a pivot of focus of, any change?
So for us, as I was mentioning, initially when I decided that I was going to start a company, I started working on a social app. And so in a sense, the first thing that I went for, it was like completely wrong. And while I had a lot of fun doing it, and it was good to like build something and get it in the hands of actual users who really liked the product for whatever reason and had a lot of fun on it. I had to like completely scrap that thing, be like, no, this is not the direction of where we're gonna go. But I think what you're trying to maybe get to is once we committed. So that was maybe like the first 2-3 months, and we kind of like did it as like, just like, let's try it. And then quickly pivoted away. One thing, like in general, when it comes to like pivots, and I think the best pivots, I think Elad Gil, who's one of the early investors in Warp also, he talked about it as the best pivots he has seen as where the idea, like you change the market entirely. Like you go from like whatever you're doing to like completely different. And the most common failure for when people try to pivot is like they'll slightly change the problem statement or the user case or whatever, and they try to do it. And the reason it doesn't work is because like the general market they're in has something about it that makes it a bad area for them to go after. So in our case, I think we were, in the sense that like, fortunate to pick a market that is really, really big and continues to grow and is not going away, and also happened to be kind of like at the edge of this like new technology coming up, where we took the bet of like, we'll be able to use it to build a much better system here. But like on a more like I think you zoom out and it kind of looks like this, right? Things are going up and like kind of steadily growing. But on a more micro, it's always like, it's like that. So even right now, like I'm we're 30 plus people quickly growing. We went from 3x the headcount, the team size in the last 4 or 5 months. We're rapidly scaling. I think we found this like great office in New York a couple months ago. We're probably gonna outgrow it soon. But like at a day-to-day, I'm still like, man, this seems tough, and like there's all these problems, and there's like, so it is a bit of a constant thing. My sense is listening from, like I was listening to this great talk from Frank Slootman, who's now the chairman, but was up until maybe last year, the CEO of Snowflake. He's very famous for just like being this very hardcore, intense, he's Dutch, very kind of this like determined guy, right? And he talks about it as like, there's no end to it. Like you can go to the Snowflake level, $100 billion IPO. That guy, you ask him, what's going on? He's gonna say, everything's fucked, right? Like it's screwed. Like there's all these things that are going horribly, and like these are all the things that we could die from. And it's just a disaster, terrifying things day in, day out. So I don't know if he's not exaggerating in this sense, but like, yeah, it is just like the reality. Like if you're gonna be doing this, there's always going to be like some amount of doubt, questioning, because we don't have perfect information. If we did, we would know, and then like the investors would just invest, and like always, like there will be just like 10 companies a year. But that's not the case. We don't have perfect information, and a lot of it comes down to like how much determined you are to just like keep going, and with some amount of confluence of luck. So yeah. I think we're at time a little bit. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you guys so much.
I appreciate you all being here.